They say he died in silence, not out of humility, but because he believed the sound of his own chewing was sacred. Deep beneath the palace, past the marble halls, carved with God's heed erased, past the trembling guards, too afraid to speak his name, there was a chamber, a golden chamber. No windows, no crosses, no throne, because he needed none. He sat on the floor, legs folded beneath him, robed in silk, woven with fireflies and powdered saffron. Before him, a silver plate piled with roasted peacock, figs soaked in honeyed wine, and a goose's liver smeared with molten gold. Real gold, shaved fine, dusted over every bite, as if eating the sun might make him shine brighter. They watched him, not for approval, but to avoid death. One wrong glance, one breath too loud, and they could be next. Even the slaves who carried his food walked backward. He called himself divine. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, divine in the flesh, born of stars, kissed by Jupiter, unbound by law. His skin was not skin, it was prophecy. His breath was not breath, it was revelation. And his hunger was never for food. It was for worship, for fear, for the sound of a world too terrified to speak back. This is not the tale of a brilliant emperor who spiraled into madness. There is no tragedy here, no fall from grace. The only thing that fell was the mask, and when it dropped, there was no man beneath it, only a void shaped like a god. He did not lose himself, he devoured himself, one golden bite at a time. And his people, they cheered, they built statues of his gaze, bathed their children in oils he had touched. Not because they loved him, but because they were told to question him is to question the sun. But a God who needs to remind you he is divine is already rotting. The records call him emperor, but none dare speak the word mad. Madness, after all, is a human illness, and he had long since declared himself something more. Was he mad, or were they just afraid? Was the madness in his mind, or in their silence? Carried his urine in crystal flasks and buried his nail clippings in velvet-lined boxes. And when his stomach began to bloat, when his eyes sank into yellow wells, and his tongue swelled from too much gold and too little truth, they said it was divine transformation, that his body could not contain so much light. That pain was proof of holiness, that he was becoming something higher. He once declared to see his bride and ordered the ocean whipped for disobedience. He staged weddings to the moon, burned libraries to erase what came before him, and when a single senator asked why, his tongue was cut out and served to dogs. Even that, they said, was mercy. But the truth is simpler, quieter, more terrifying. He was told from birth that the blood in his veins was not red, but celestial, that gods do not cry, that emperors do not bleed. So, when the fear came, and it always comes, he turned it outward, blamed demons, then shadows, then servants, then Rome itself. And with each finger pointed, another body dropped. They kissed his feet when he walked. But when he died, they dragged him by the ankles through the gate he once gilded. From divine halls to execution dungeons, from being hailed as the son of Jupiter, to rotting in a ditch where even the dogs refused to feed. There were no final words, only a gurgle of gold and bile and silence. Not reverent silence, but the kind that comes after something unholy has passed. The kind that lingers in curtains and walls. The kind that history tries to forget, but it cannot. Because before the blood, before the blades, before the golden shrines and screams, there was a boy who was told that the stars bowed to him, that he could not be wrong, that every mirror was a prophecy. Can't he believe them? Okay? He believed them until there was no one left to correct him, until even the air in the room dared not resist his breath. This is not a story about power, Kate. It is a story about delusion, but not his alone. The delusion of those who bowed, who built temples, who whispered praise they did not mean. Because sometimes the most dangerous madness is not the one that reigns, but the one that obeys. He dined on gold, okay? And Rome paid the bill. And now, to understand how the god was forged, we must step backward. Not to the palace, but to the nursery. Not to the screams, but to the first lie whispered in a cradle. You are not like the others. And he never was. He was born beneath silk canopies, not to the cries of his mother, but to the chants of priests. Rome did not greet him with lullabies, but with prophecy. The stars had aligned. They said the gods had chosen to walk among men once more. Before his lips touched milk, His name was already etched beside Jupiter's. His crib was gilded, his blankets stitched with silver thread, and every servant who touched him was forbidden to speak unless reciting a blessing. To gaze upon his face was to behold divinity mid-formation, raw, soft, untested, but no less holy. He did not learn to walk among toys and laughter, but in marble halls where grown men bowed and kissed his feet. His first steps were watched not with joy, but with terror, as if each movement was a cosmic omen. A tutor once wrote, "He listens like he remembers the womb." They mistook his stillness for wisdom, his silence for prophecy. But children are mirrors, and when he saw the world kneel, he learned to rise. He grew up surrounded by fear, disguised as reverence. Every whim obeyed, every cruelty praised. When he tore the wings off a bird, they called it a ritual. When he drowned his playmate in a fountain, they whispered, "The gods are jealous." They test him early. Nothing he did was wrong. Not because he was good, but because Rome had decided he could not be. A god must not apologize. And so he never did. By the time he could read, he read only scrolls about himself, decrees written in advance of his deeds, portraits painted before his face had finished forming. His childhood was not a becoming, it was a coronation in slow motion. He grew beneath the weight of expectation until he could no longer see the difference between destiny and demand. Rome, bloated with fear and fractured by enemies within and without, looked to him not as a child, but as a cure. They were tired of emperors who bled, who doubted, who died. What they wanted was certainty, and he gave it to them. With blank eyes and a voice that never stuttered, he declared himself more than flesh. He was what came after death, the bridge between altar and empire, a living oracle. And when he spoke, they listened. He told them the gods had revealed new laws, that temples must bear only his image, that statues of Jupiter must be recarved in his likeness. Thunder was his grief and sunlight his joy. And the people, worn down by war and famine and centuries of broken rulers, whispered to one another, "Perhaps he truly is divine, 'cause when hope dies, faith will take anything with teeth." His court became a shrine. Tea, his breath was bottled in glass. His footsteps mapped like constellations. The Senate no longer debated. They echoed. Whatever he said, they repeated. Whatever he touched, they worshipped. His madness, if it existed, was not madness at all. It was doctrine. But power that begins in childhood carries a special kind of poison. It fuses with the soul before the soul learns what mercy is. And so he did not rule with cruelty. He ruled with purity, the most dangerous kind. It's a purity of someone who believes he cannot be wrong. Someone who has never taught the difference between the sacred and the self. They called him the new sun, the living flame, the last breath of the gods. He smiled, not because he believed them, but because no one had ever taught him how to doubt. But tell me this, when a boy is crowned before he learns to cry, does he ever become a man, or just a myth with skin? It began with a question, shouted in rebellion, not hurled in rage, but whispered, trembling, from the lips of a man who had once bounced the boy emperor on his knee. A question too small to matter, too gentle to threaten. Should we not test the gold first? He asked, eyes lowered, hands shaking as servants prepared to feed the emperor a meal laced in powdered metal. The chamber fell silent. Even the flames and the torches seemed to shrink. Hey, in that moment, a new law was born. To question him was to defile the divine. The man vanished the next day. No body, no grave, only a new dish added to the imperial feast, goose liver dusted with more gold. The boy did not ask what happened to his old friend. He only chewed and nodded and decreed that gold was now sacred for the stomach, not just the treasury, okay? That anything less was peasants' fare, okay? And so Rome obeyed. Again, but gold is not food, and bodies are not altars. Within weeks, he began to sweat through his robes. His gums bled. His sleep fractured into violent spasms. Physicians gathered and spoke in riddles. One dared whisper the truth, that gold corrupts the gut, that this was poison masquerading as divinity. And for this act of treason, he was flayed alive. His screams used to accompany dinner. It was then the emperor began to speak in riddles, in oracles. He claimed the gods spoke through him in dreams, through reflections, through the cries of the dying. And the people listened, not because they believed, but because it was safer to nod. He declared that from now on, all speech must rhyme, that sentences without poetry were blasphemous. Senators began to script their greetings like plays. Bakers named their bread after stars. Slaves were whipped for speaking plainly. This was not madness in the eyes of the court. This was vision. This was enlightenment, he said. He sees what we cannot. And indeed, he did. He saw demons in his wine, ghosts in his mirrors, shadows in the faces of his most loyal guards, and one by one, those shadows were removed. First by exile, then by fire, then by hooks and blades in the catacombs below the palace. He ordered the sun to be worshipped only through him. He renamed the months after his moods. He outlawed yawning, claiming it insulted the heavens. And when the people began to starve, he blamed the moon, ordered it stoned. But the first true crack, the one they couldn't hide, came not from his proclamations, but from his reflection. One night, he stood before a silver mirror and spat at his own face. "You are not me," he whispered. "You are the deceiver." The next morning, every mirror in the palace was shattered, every reflective surface covered in ash. "He sees too much," they said, nervously. The divine often do, yet beneath the robes, beneath the chants and the gold and the fear, something had shifted. The people still clapped, still knelt, still chanted his name, okay? But now their eyes flickered with something else, a silence, not of awe, but of calculation, of survival. They began to ask each other, not aloud, but in glances, if gods can bleed, can they be killed? And still, he spoke. His oracles grew darker. Blood must sanctify the soil, he declared. Loyalty must be tasted. He licked wine from the throats of trembling boys and called it communion. He buried pregnant women alive and said it was rebirth. And every time the Senate gathered, they sat closer to the exits, but no one moved. Not yet, because the first lie had already taken root. The lie that gods cannot fall. The lie that had fed them all, even him. Because here is the tragedy. The moment he first lied as an oracle, he believed it was truth, and in that, he became something worse than a tyrant. He became a vessel, not of the gods, but of fear, so complete it spoke in its own voice. Tell me, when the oracle begins to believe his own prophecy, who is left to pull him back into the world of men? Or is that the point? That by the time the lie is heard, it's already too late. It began with shadows. Not the kind cast by flame or torchlight, but the kind that grew in the corners of his mind, shapeless, scentless, voiceless, yet always watching. He claimed they spoke to him at night, that they wept in his walls, that the darkness outside his chambers was not nightfall, but treachery made visible. He sealed the windows, burned every tapestry that bore faces he did not recognize. He banned the color black, then purple, then red, each accused of conspiring against him. The palace, once radiant with opulence, dimmed into a theater of paranoia. Guards changed shifts every hour because he believed time itself was plotting. Sedition. He had the birds in the courtyard slaughtered. Too many eyes, he said. Ministers were forbidden from whispering. Courtiers were forbidden from turning their backs. And when the emperor entered a room, all had to freeze. To move in his presence was to challenge fate, but even stillness could not stop the rot. Rumors moved faster than laws. Grain shipments vanished. Towns went weeks without bread. Disease bloomed in the gutters of Rome like a second harvest. And yet he laughed, not from joy, but because he believed the suffering confirmed his sanctity. They must hunger, he declared, so I may be full. His court became a shrine to delusion, the theater of loyalty written in blood. He replaced his advisors with children, pliable, terrified, eager to please. He crowned a statue of himself with a crown of thorns and demanded prayers be recited in his name. He renamed the days of the week after his virtues: Humility Day, Radiance Day, Immortality Day, and he insisted no one sleep on Immortality Day because death sleeps. And I do not. But beneath the rituals, something more primal had awakened in him. Fear, not of rebellion, not of Rome, but of the dark. He forbade all candles from being extinguished. Servants were chained beside his bed to watch the shadows while he slept. A single flickering light would send him into convulsions. He ordered the sun to rise faster. When it didn't, he had the astronomers executed. The Senate, once sycophantic, now moved with the silence of prey. No one spoke first. No one ate before him. Even the generals, once proud, lowered their swords when he passed. But their silence wasn't reverence. It was recoil. Outside the palace, fires burned. Rebellions flickered in the provinces. But he called them illusions. He said the gods were testing him. Case that flames could not touch him. Case that every rebel would be reborn as his servant in the afterlife. And so he did nothing. Not out of mercy, but because he believed the empire would correct itself. Just as a body fights a fever. But it wasn't fever. It was collapse. A famine swept across the heartland. Mothers sold their children for flour. Fathers carved meat from corpses in the street. The temples, once full, stood empty, abandoned by both priests and prayer. And still, in the palace, the emperor sang hymns to himself and bathed in milk steeped with gold. Let them hunger, he whispered. The gods starved too. Before the stars were born, he stopped addressing the Senate. He spoke only to statues. And when one statue cracked from age, he wept for 3 days and ordered its sculptor executed. For murder, at last, he declared that light itself was a lie. That day was a trick of the sky to test his divinity. He locked himself underground, built a throne room without a single opening. No windows, no doors, only a hole in the ceiling, through which food was lowered on a velvet rope. And there he sat, crowned in silence, ruling nothing, and fearing everything. What do we call a man who destroys the world around him just to feel safe in it? Because in that dark chamber, buried beneath marble and myth, he was not God. He was child, cold, terrified, alone, and not one voice above dared call him back. Can you tell the difference between faith and fear? The gods do not rot, or so he believed. But flesh has no allegiance to delusion. It obeys only time. And time, long silenced in the golden chambers of his reign, began to speak through the cracks in his skin. The first sign was his breath, sweet at first from dates, figs, and wine, but then sour, metallic, and warm with decay. Then came the swelling, his belly distended grotesquely, as if something inside him pushed outward, trying to escape. Servants whispered of curses, of divine trials, but physicians, those not yet executed, knew the truth. Gold is not meant for blood. He had consumed it for years, powdered, it's melted, mixed into his bread, his wine, even his medicines. His veins shimmered with it, his organs turned to brittle stone. He began to tremble uncontrollably. His teeth fell out one by one, roots black, gums receding into mush. Still, he smiled. Still, he claimed it was ascension, that the gods were remaking him, purifying his mortal form into something eternal. But the mirrors, now banned from the palace, could not lie. His skin turned yellow, then gray. Sores bloomed across his arms like diseased roses. His hair thinned, clumped, and disappeared. He no longer stood. He was carried on silken cushions, his limbs too weak to support him. His hands, once held aloft to bless the masses, now shook too violently to hold a goblet. So he was fed by others, one slave per meal, chosen, then executed to prevent poison. Their blood was tested against his wine, their final cries drowned out by flutes and hymns sung to drown out the smell. The scent of death grew strong around him. It clung to curtains, it soaked the marble. He wore perfume thick as tar, but it could not mask the rot beneath his robes. Maggots were found in his bed. Rat chewed the edge of his foot while he slept. He did not wake. Still, the court bowed. Still, they chanted. Still, they kissed the feet that blistered and oozed. To gag in his presence was treason. To sweat was sacrilege. And so they all became statues, beautiful, hollow, silent, watching as the god they built collapsed inside himself. He ordered new portraits, radiant, divine, untouched by time. Painters wept as they worked, not from emotion, but fear. To paint the truth was to die. And so history began to fracture. The man in the paintings glowed. The man on the cushions leaked, and yet he believed it, or pretended to, which was worse. One day he tried to speak to the people to deliver what he called a sermon of immortality. But the moment he opened his mouth, blood poured from his nose, then his ears. He collapsed before the crowd. No one moved, no one dared. For hours, his body twitched beneath the sun until he was finally dragged back to his chamber. He did not remember the sermon. He only asked, did they weep for joy? He no longer bathed. The water stung his sores. Instead, he was wiped with wind-drenched silk. Flies followed him. They clung to his lips, his ears, his fingers, as if drawn not to his holiness, but to the banquet of his decomposition. And yet he smiled. He still smiled, because he had convinced himself that this suffering was divine, that each ulcer was a mark of transcendence, that the gold corroding his organs was not poison, but prophecy. I am being refined, he whispered. The gods are melting me into perfection. But even gods must face mirrors, eventually. And though his palace had none, his body had become one. A mirror to every sin he had committed, every silence he demanded, every truth he buried beneath golden lies. How many must kneel before a corpse before they realize it cannot bless them? They say death comes quietly, that it slips beneath the door, gentle as dust, unnoticed until the body stills, But for him, death arrived like a lover long denied, violent, intimate, unforgiving. It began, as many deaths do, with a betrayal, not by dagger or blade, but by a body that could no longer pretend it was holy. One morning, he awoke, choking, not on blood, not on rot, but on gold, thin sheets of it laid across his tongue, meant to sanctify his breath. They stuck to the roof of his mouth like wax. He gasped, he clawed, and for the first time in his life, he looked afraid. The slaves ran. The guards froze. No one knew what to do. No one had ever been told how a god should die. And so he writhed alone, tangled in silks, arms flailing like a broken puppet. He tried to scream, but the gold muffled every sound. His eyes bulged. One of them burst. His lips cracked open, bleeding down his chin. He vomited black. Bile glinted in the candlelight. They say he whispered something, a name, a plea, a curse, but no one leaned close enough to hear. Or perhaps no one dared admit they had heard it all. And then he stilled. A golden leaf still clung to his teeth. His body twitched once more, a final revolt, and then collapsed inward. He lay there for hours, no one touching him, as if death itself might be contagious. And perhaps it was. Eventually, they wrapped him in white, not to honor him, but to hide the decay. His stomach had bloated grotesquely, splitting the fabric. His skin peeled when moved. The maggots stirred. They stuffed herbs beneath his tongue, not for ritual, but to hide the smell. There was no funeral, no procession, only a quiet fire deep in the palace gardens. His body placed upon a pyre laced with perfumes and lies. They burned him quickly, too quickly, as if afraid he might return. And even then, they lied. The Senate declared a vision had taken him, that he had been called home by the stars, that he had become light. Statues were not torn down. They were crowned. New coins were minted. Not in mourning, but in pretense. To admit his death was to admit he had ever been mortal. And that was more dangerous than any rebellion. Yet the people knew. They always knew. They whispered of how he screamed, of how the smell lingered in the halls, of how the rats would not go near his bedchamber for weeks. Some said he still walked the corridors at night, not as a spirit, but as a memory too heavy to rot. You say, his shadow could be seen just before dawn, limping, shivering, muttering prayers to himself. But he was gone, not to heaven, not to myth. He was gone because he was never built to last, because gods are not born, they are made. And when the gold melts, all that's left is bone. So tell me, if a god can choke on the offerings made to him, was he ever a god at all, or just a man lost in the echo of his own lie? When the fire died, there was no ash, not because the body had vanished, but because the palace had erased it before the flames even touched bone. Servants were silenced, witnesses bribed or buried. The pyre, once sacred ground, was paved. Over within days, a garden was planted in its place. Roses, vines, lilies, flowers that masked the stench of what had once ruled. His name, once etched into marble, was scraped off coin and column. His decrees were burned in secret. Statues toppled, melted, recast as gods less frightening. The empire, bloated with guilt, entered a ritual of forgetting. There were no songs, no mourning, no gravesite, only silence. A silence that stretched from palace walls to village corners. People learned not to speak of him, not because they feared his wrath, but because they feared what it meant to have once believed in him. The priests, who had declared him divine, wept in private and rewrote scripture. The generals claimed they had served under protest. Even the slaves spat on the floor when his name was whispered, a performance of contempt they had once reserved for praise. But memory is stubborn. It lives not in records, but in flesh. Kay, and there were those who could not forget. Kay, child who remembered the day her father was flayed for laughing in the marketplace. Kay, mother who could still smell the burning hair of her daughter sacrificed in one of his sun feasts. A soldier who watched his friend buried alive for looking away too slowly. These memories, too dangerous to speak aloud, festered in silence, deep, rotting roots beneath the kingdom desperate to bloom again. And then came the revisionists, the poets, the sculptors, the scholars. They tried to reshape him, not as a god, not as a monster, but as a misunderstood dreamer. He believed too deeply, they wrote. He reached too far. They called his reign a golden sickness, a divine fever, anything but what it truly was, a mirror held to the face of empire, because Rome had not been his victim, it had been his accomplice. They had fed his delusion. They had burned their own doubts at the altar of obedience. And when the cost arrived in hunger, plague, silence, and death, they paid it not with rebellion or with whispers. Even the palace, long after his bones were gone, remembered. Doors creaked in strange winds. Paintings aged too fast. A single chamber, sealed for decades, was found to contain nothing but a throne and a silver plate, still glinting with traces of gold. No one claimed it. No one cleaned it. It was left to rot, a quiet testament to what cannot be buried. Years passed. New emperors rose, careful to speak with humility, careful not to gild their names too brightly. But the fear remained, not of another tyrant, but of the people's own weakness, their willingness to kneel, their hunger for gods in human skin, their silence in the face of decay, because power is not taken by madness, okay? It is offered by silence. And so, what do we call a nation that watched a man eat himself into godhood and did nothing but cheer? Do we mourn the emperor or the mirror? He is not remembered for what he did, but for what he revealed, not in action, but in reflection. For in every tyrant's face, there is a ghost of the people who built him, a whisper of the applause that fed him, a trace of the silence that clothed him. He died choking on gold. Yes, but it was Rome that melted it. Rome that fed it to him. Rome that clapped as he swallowed. And long after his name was buried, he lived on, not in temples, not in scripture, but in every chamber where truth is twisted to suit comfort, where power grows unchecked, draped in ceremony, where doubt is called treason. He became less a man, more a warning, whispered from generation to generation. Beware the ruler who stops bleeding, for he may already think himself divine. Centuries passed. The empire crumbled, rose, and changed its face. But the memory of him flickered in the corners. In laws written to prevent excess, in prayers that no longer named emperors, in architecture that avoided mirrors. Even the gold used in rituals was tested, measured, rationed, as if afraid it might start speaking in its voice again. And yet, the myth returned. As myths do, a general centuries later found his likeness in a coin pressed by accident. He kept it, called it a charm. Questioned, he said. He ruled wrongly, but he ruled. In private, he began eating from gold plates, wearing perfume thicker than dust, smiling in rooms without laughter. Within a year, rebellion bloomed. The myth had awakened again, not as memory, but as temptation. Historians debated his mind. Was he mad? Was he poisoned by the wealth around him? Was he born broken or broken by worship? No answer satisfied, because the real horror was not in him, but in how easily he rose, how few resisted, how eager the world was to bow to anything that glittered in modern times. His name is spoken in books, in lectures, in late-night debates. Professors call him the divine delusion. Psychologists use him as a study in narcissism. Political theorists call him a case of total autotheism. But none of these terms are enough. None of them match the image that still haunts, a trembling hand reaching for one more bite of gold, while the world burns outside the palace gates. Even now, some worship him quietly, not as a god, but as a fantasy of unchecked freedom. Rule without consequence. They admire him not because he ruled well, but because he was feared, because he made the world kneel, because somewhere deep in the human heart, there is a longing not to be ruled, but to rule. Even if it ends in ruin, he is not dead, not truly. He lives in every echo of absolute obedience. In every court that punishes truth as rebellion, Dan, every leader who calls themselves Savior, Father, God. The only thing that changes is the name. And so, its legacy is not stone or scripture, but a question. If given the power to be worshipped, how many of us would resist it? And how many would wrap ourselves in gold and begin the feast? It was meant to stay hidden, buried beneath layers of marble, ash, and shame. A room walled off not by bricks, but by silence. For centuries, no records mentioned it. Maps of the palace skipped its dimensions. The servants who built it were blinded after construction. The guards who stood watch outside were rotated every hour and sworn to secrecy under threat of crucifixion. And then, one day, the empire fell. Dust gathered, walls cracked, and memory, as it always does, began to peel back its skin. In the late 19th century, a team of archaeologists digging through the ruins of the imperial palace struck something strange, a hollow beneath stone. When they broke through, the air was dry and sour, as if time itself had rotted in place. They stepped inside, expecting bones or treasure. What they found was something far more disturbing. A throne, not wood, not stone, but cast entirely of gold, gilded, grotesque, baroque in its excess. Every inch etched with faces twisted in agony, mouths open, eyes wide. Not saints, not soldiers, but slaves. Before it stood a long table, also gold. On it, a single plate, a silver chalice, and a knife, still stained dark. No blood remained, only the scent of metal and mold. Carvings on the wall bore no name, only one phrase, repeated again and again. I am the Son. I am the Son. I am the Son. They photographed it, cataloged it, but no museum accepted the findings. No government issued a statement. Even in an age of reason, some truths remain too loud. The lead archaeologist retired the following year. When asked about the chamber, he reportedly whispered, "We didn't find a room, we found a confession." Later analysis of trace materials shocked even the most skeptical scholars. Cold, microscopic flakes were discovered in the dust that coated the chalice. Traces of bile, human skin, and digested metal in the cracks of the plate, and on the armrests of the throne, fingernail marks, deep and panicked. Carved into gold with desperation no myth could disguise. The room had not been a temple, it had been a prison, but not for the people. For him, in those final days, long after the empire had turned from him, he had locked himself there. No windows, no doors, just a single shaft of light from above, like a sunbeam sent from the heavens. It wasn't worship, it was withdrawal. It's the last meal of a man who mistook gold for salvation, who feasted on his own reflection until there was nothing left to chew. No body was ever found, only the things he left behind. A throne too heavy to move, a cup too cursed to drain, and a silence that seemed to murmur even after the chamber was sealed once more, because history forgets what it cannot name. But gold remembers, and if gold could speak, what would it say of the man who tried to become God through its touch? Would it sing, or would it scream? There are stories that never make it into scrolls or statues. Stories too soft, too human, too inconvenient to be carved into marble. Such story was found not in a palace, but in a drawer. A letter, yellowed and water-damaged, tucked inside a rusted jewelry box in the attic of an old Roman villa. It bore no seal, no date, only a name scribbled in the corner: Livia. She had been a nursemaid, one of the first hands to cradle the boy emperor before he was emperor, long before gold, before blood, before mirrors. In the letter, she wrote not of glory or prophecy, but of a child who cried when left alone, who would wail if the door closed too loudly, who clung to her sleeve at night and asked over and over, "Why doesn't the sun wait for me?" He was not born cruel. He was born afraid. She described how the priests came early, how they insisted he be bathed in sacred oils, not touched with common hands, how they replaced lullabies with chants, toys with relics, affection with ritual. When he laughed too loudly, they silenced him. When he wept, they declared it divine rain. When he asked for his mother, they told him he needed no such thing. He was not born from a woman. But through her, and in time, he stopped asking. Livia's letter recounts the last day she saw him. He was 5, the high priests had declared. He must now be raised by men of spirit. She tried to hold him one final time. He refused, not out of pride, but out of confusion. "Am I not a god now?" he asked her. "Gods don't need hugs." And she, powerless, kissed his forehead and left. She never heard his voice again. That letter, fragile and hay-raced by moisture, said more than any scroll of conquest. It revealed not a monster, but a child turned into one. Not a tyrant, but a mirror warped too early by the weight of others' dreams. For what is more terrifying than a child never taught limits, only destiny? He had not chosen the gold, rituals, the silence. He had been told they were love, and love misunderstood becomes the cruelest legacy of all. So tell me, if a boy is taught he is divine before he learns what it means to be loved, does he ever become human again? He is long dead, the ashes scattered, the name buried, the throne forgotten, and yet he lives, not in form, but in echo, not in temples, but in offices, palaces, parliaments, and screens. The God Emperor who ate gold walks beside us still, cloaked in different colors, speaking in new tongues. For while his crown has crumbled, the pattern he etched remains intact. Worship the self, silence the other, deny the rot until it feasts on you from within. We see him in every ruler who demands applause before reason, in every regime that punishes dissent, not with argument, but with disappearance, in the man who declares himself the voice of the people and then silences their cries, in the leader who rewrites law to suit ego, who stages parades while the people starve, who builds statues before building shelter, who punishes truth as betrayal and adorns delusion with garlands of national pride. His story repeats, not as a myth, but as a manual, a warning printed in gold and bound with fear. In North Korea, children sing 2 portraits they've never touched. In cults, leaders drink first, eat first, speak last, their silence called wisdom, their gaze interpreted like scripture. In boardrooms and billion-dollar towers, men build empires on the altar of their image. They surround themselves with yes men, with worshipers, with curated applause. And when the mirrors begin to crack, they fire the ones who hold them. The emperor's madness was not madness alone. It was power, unchallenged. It was belief, unexamined. It was need, raw and bottomless, to be adored at all costs. The gold he ate lives now in digital form, in likes, in shares, in headlines that bend toward ego. Modern power does not always bleed, but it still devours. It devours honesty, conscience, humility. And when the banquet ends, as it always does, we ask again, was he mad? Or were we simply hungry for someone to believe in, even if they were hollow? 'Cause the truth is unbearable, that every god in history was made by us. And when we look into the mirror, do we see ourselves, or the next crown waiting to be worn? There was no ceremony, no choir, no sunset casting holy light across the floor, golden plate dented at the edges, and a trembling hand reaching for one final taste. A grape soaked in mercury, polished with powdered gold. He believed it would grant him eternity, that his body, racked with sores and sickness, could still become divine through one last sacrifice. He placed it on his tongue with reverence, not hunger, not even hope, but ritual. Because in the end, he didn't eat to survive. He ate to be worshipped. Around him, the room pulsed with silence. No applause, no chanting, no prayers, only the sound of breath, his own, slowing. The walls, once adorned with mirrors, were now bare, but he didn't need glass to see himself. His reflection lived in the eyes of the frightened, in the echo of footsteps that never dared to approach, in the taste of gold that lingered like regret on his teeth. He had everything and nothing, no friends, no family, only attendants who watched with vacant eyes, waiting to see if gods could die. And when his lips turned blue, when his limbs stiffened, when the gold burned through the last barrier of his stomach and touched the hollow place where his soul might have been, they did not cry. They bowed, then backed away, as if afraid his final breath might reach them. Outside, the city slept beneath a sky indifferent to kings. No comet marked the moment. No beast wailed. No river turned red. Its passing came like dust settling, weightless, invisible, inescapable. But the image remained. A plate, a grape, a crown that no longer fit the shape of his skull. No legend was carved, no shrine raised, only silence, deep, reverent, suffocating. It's a kind of silence that lingers, not because something sacred has ended, but because something shameful refuses to speak. And so the story ends not with a sword or a scream or a storm, but with a man dying in a room full of gold, surrounded by everything he ever wanted, and no one who ever loved him. Because in the end, gold does not save, power does not love, and gods who dine alone always choke.